with most investors going about life, investing, and retirement planning as if nothing unusual has happened to our financial system, not realizing the repercussions of the 11 trillion that's been pumped into the US financial system in the past 18 months alone. I just want to share with you a report we have just put out. At least 4 billionaires have stated publicly that Americans aren't paying enough attention to this development. And now a former Goldman Sachs banker says sooner than most people think, millions of Americans will potentially be pushed down out of the middle class, out of private retirement, and out of a decent life based on independence and privacy into a collectivist nightmare he calls financial lockdown. So find out how to protect yourself, your money, and your family with a free copy of his new report. In it, he'll show you the 4 steps he recommends that you take immediately. So if you'd like a free copy of the report, you simply have to go to 2022wakeupcall.com. Again, that's 2022wakeupcall.com. Hi, this is Daniela Cambone, and welcome back to Stansberry Research. My guest today says that we are entering a new era of global turbulence. Please welcome back to the show the best-selling author of The Coming Collapse of China, Gordon Chang. Gordon, always good to be with you. Thanks for being back with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
I want to start by getting your thoughts on the latest news coming out of Shanghai and the lockdowns there. Tell us the real deal. What are you hearing? What is happening?
Well, in Shanghai, the number of cases is going down. It's not at a point where the regime feels that it can release the extreme COVID control measures that they've been imposing on Shanghai, a city of more than 25 million people. It's basically on indefinite lockdown. What's fascinating is that we're seeing the same trajectory in Beijing. It's not on full lockdown, but nonetheless, they are extending all sorts of measures. So, for instance, the schools are closed, and they will be closed beyond the May Day holiday, which was just announced. Also, we are seeing increased testing. People in about 12 of the 16 districts are now going to undergo testing 3 days in a row. So this is really quite extreme. But the big story here, it's not just the big cities of Shanghai and Beijing, it's really around the eastern part of the country. This is in Dandong, for instance, in the northeast, Yiwu in Zhejiang province, and also in the south, which is China's factory floor. So in Guangdong province, you have various control measures that are imposed on, for instance, Shenzhen, again, and Guangzhou, the capital. So this is afflicting the entire eastern portion of the country. And the regime really, of course, can't control the coronavirus because it's spreading very fast.
I mean, the images, and I read the story that you saw, an elderly man being taken away in a body bag. He was still alive. I mean, I'm just trying to understand. They have this zero COVID strategy in place, but it's obviously crippled the country, crippling the citizens. They've been in lockdown since March. The supply chain issues are out of whack right now. I mean, what's next? How does this unfold?
I don't think Beijing really knows how it's going to unfold because Omicron BA2, which is the subvariant that's been ripping through China, is just traveling at will. There's a couple things going on here. So, for instance, Beijing knows it does not have an effective vaccine. Its 2 primary vaccines weren't very good against Delta and the other variants, and has no effect at all on Omicron BA2. So basically, Beijing believes that its only defense is isolation. And by the way, they wouldn't import the mRNA vaccines from America because that would be politically dynamite. So basically, they have sacrificed the health of their country because they wanted to show that their vaccines were better than everybody else's. But there are other 2 things, and these are Communist Party inside politics. One of them is that Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, is considered to be the author of the zero COVID policy. So at a politically sensitive time in what most people think will be the run-up to the 20th National Congress, if it's held according to schedule, it'll be held in October or November. That's where Xi wants his precedent-breaking 3rd term as general secretary of the party. So he's not allowing any criticism or adjustment of the policy because that might undermine his chance of getting that 3rd term. And then the other thing is that essentially the Communist Party has made its control of the disease a test of its legitimacy. It did that in early 2020, where it said that its ability to deal with COVID showed that its form of governance was superior to democracy. So every case, every death in China is a critical threat to the regime. So you put all that together, it means that the regime is pretty hard-headed at this point.
Gordon, the lockdown are bringing back memories of the lockdowns in Wuhan when the pandemic first broke out. My question to you is, do you see this being a domino effect? We saw the lockdown first in Wuhan, then it spread to the rest of the world. Will history repeat itself?
Um, Probably not. I mean, this disease is spread around the world already. So it's whatever is from China is probably not going to have the effect that it did in early 2020 when it was confined to the central part of China. And then, of course, it spread throughout the world. This time, it's already everywhere else. But the point is that China is preventing basically most air travel, and a lot of travel is not permitted anymore anyway, as a practical matter. So there will be effects of China's problems that will ripple through supply chains, for instance, but I don't think it'll be the actual disease itself this time.
I want to pull up one tweet I found interesting that you recently posted, Gordon. You said, interestingly enough, China and Russia are both falling apart at the exact same moment in time. Yes, it's quite interesting. My question to you is this: China has always been extremely protective of their economy. This is obviously dismantling their economy. Why this move?
Because Xi Jinping wants that third term. I mean, that alone explains why they are willing to undermine their economy. And remember, China right now is in contraction, not just on a month-to-month basis, but also year to year. We saw the first indications from April, these purchasing managers' indices, where there are disastrous plunges in both the services and the manufacturing numbers. You go back to March, the economy probably was in contraction on certainly month to month, probably also year to year. And that means it's going to be very difficult for China to meet its 5.5% growth target for the year because the second quarter is going to be a disaster. It's going to be negative if they are honest with the numbers. I'm sure they're not going to be because the numbers have become especially political this year. But
Mhm.
nonetheless, people know that China is in distress.
Gordon, what does this mean for the Chinese yuan? We saw talk of, is the US dollar at risk of losing its reserve currency status? We see countries like Saudi Arabia looking outside of the US dollar, looking at the Chinese yuan. But what does this mean for the future of their currency now?
About a week and a half ago, we saw that sudden 3% drop in the value of the renminbi. That was reminiscent of what happened in 2015 when we had the currency shocks in China. The currency is extremely weak. The People's Bank of China, the central bank, would like to drop rates. They are trying to ease. They know they need to do this because the economy is in such bad shape, but they're also worried about capital flight. In March, the last month for which we have statistics, there was $17.5 billion of outflow from portfolio investments. That was a record. And by the way, this was not some part of an emerging market story. This was just China itself. It shows that the Chinese currency is in no condition to challenge the dollar, which, by the way, is strong because the Fed is tightening. So the dollar is in an upswing, the renminbi is in a downswing. And China's problems are not going to get any better, at least within the next month or so. So, yeah, the
For
Saudis might want to buy a little bit of oil in renminbi, but they're not really going to want to do that and hold that currency long term
right.
when the currency is so weak.
And you're right, we are seeing a strong US dollar at the start of this tightening cycle. Usually, what happens, historically speaking, and then it usually comes back down. So it'll be interesting to watch the dollar's trajectory here. Uh, Gordon, you've also said that Biden's administration is not doing a good enough job of protecting the US from China. What do you mean by that?
If you look at the actions of the Biden administration, a lot of them are very pro-Beijing, and that is a real concern. So, for instance, they want to grant more waivers from the Section 301 tariffs. Those tariffs were imposed in 2018 as a remedy for the theft of U.S. intellectual property. But the Biden administration has no answer for that. They just want to remove the tariffs. And that means U.S. IP is at greater risk. We have seen some other decisions which were inexplicable, especially ones from the beginning of the administration. So, for instance, removing the prohibition on the importation of Chinese equipment for the American grid. President Trump, a year before Biden took office, imposed these restrictions to protect our grid. Biden just took them off unilaterally. So we have seen a number of these decisions throughout the Biden administration that are hard to explain. Now, not a lot of people have a lot of dark explanations for it. I just think the Biden team doesn't really have a clue as to the nature of the challenge from China. They call China a competitor when China calls us an enemy. That's a dangerous mismatch for us.
Well said, Gordon. Just a final point. You say we have entered into a dangerous era of global turbulence. Gone is general peace, in is constant war.
Yeah, it feels like we have passed that inflection point. And really, a number of things have occurred. One of them is, of course, deglobalization, which was occurring before COVID, occurring before the Ukraine invasion. But nonetheless, both COVID and the invasion have accelerated a delinking of economies as companies now understand that resilience is as important as efficiency. So we're seeing talk of supply webs instead of supply chains. In other words, multiple sources of production. People are talking about bringing production closer to the point of consumption, which in our case means moving factories back to this side of the Pacific. The reason why this is important is because when you look throughout history, when even you've had high levels of trade, that hasn't protected the world from war, because really what countries look at is not the level of trade, they look at the direction of trade. And when you start to delink your economies, then the threshold for the use of force declines. That is an historic pattern. It may hold this time as well. And when Russia has taken down this whole notion of peace and stability, anything can happen, because then the bad guys start to think that they can do what they want. So we could see war spread both east and west across the Eurasian landmass, and perhaps to places like North Africa, as China, Russia, and their proxies decide to take on the international system.
So a spreading war-like scenario, Gordon.
That's entirely possible. You know, people these days talk about China has now more incentive to go after Taiwan. The most important aspect of the Ukraine war was the greatest failure of deterrence since World War II. The United States, the 27 nations of the European Union, and Great Britain had an economy that was 25 times greater than that of Russia. And yet we could not deter the Russians from violating Ukraine's sovereignty. That is a lesson that China has taken on board, and it's a lesson that the North Koreas and the Irans have taken on board as well. This is a world where everything is up for grabs, and the most dangerous periods in history are when you have to reestablish deterrence. And we are in one of those periods right now. So I think that when we look at the next couple of years, there are very few good outcomes from this.
And it's a lesson that, the U.S. has separated from Europe and working together and becoming more and more isolationist. No, Gordon?
Well, under Biden, there's been greater cooperation among NATO members. And part of it is what Trump did was he created a lot of antagonism because he was trying to get NATO members to actually meet their commitments on defense spending, the 2% limit. Well, Trump did create a lot of unhappiness, and there was only marginal improvement in defense spending in Western Europe. What it took was the Ukraine invasion to get countries like Germany to become serious about their own defense. And because of that, it's been much easier for the Biden team to work closely with NATO. Still, there's a lot that needs to be done. And Ukraine, by the way, is still very much at risk. Putin can actually accomplish much of his objectives. He can turn the tide of war. So this is still an extremely dangerous moment. And by the way, if Putin is not ejected from Ukraine, then China is going to see that as a big green light to do what it wants. Taiwan, India, Japan, the Philippines, who knows? But this is one of those times where you're seeing not only Moscow, but Beijing make these threats to use their most destructive weapons. And now North Korea has chimed in the last week or so. This means that these nations think that they can do what they want and that they can get what they want by threatening the use of nukes.
Gordon Chang, extremely turbulent times ahead. Thank you so much for joining us, author of The Coming Collapse of China. Always good speaking with you.
Thank you, Daniela.
And thank you for watching this edition of Stansberry Research. We'll have much more coming your way, so be sure to stay tuned. And don't forget, sign up at danielacambone.com so you stay on top of all these great interviews coming your way. That's it for me. Thanks for watching.
Opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the contributor and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Stansberry Research, its parent company, or affiliates.